Hi, and welcome back. We're going to talk about behavioral genetics and evolutionary psych in this segment. So let's get started. Okay, behavior genetics and evolutionary psychology. Let's start with behavior genetics, and let's start with a nice definition. The basic definition of behavior genetics is that we are going to attempt to predict individual differences from a combination of the person's heredity and their environment. So it's taking into account both genes and upbringing. It's really important to look at this definition and recognize that even though it has the word genetics in it, so a lot of times people mistakenly think, well, all they care about is inheritance. It also has the word behavior in it. They're really interested in trying to figure out what part of your outcomes are due to your genes and what part of your outcomes are due to your environment. So let's start by talking about genes. I'm sure a lot of you have taken biology classes that explain DNA and chromosomes and things, but I thought might as well start at the beginning. Here's a cell, clearly not a neuron, is it? So here we have a cell, and in its nucleus would be a bunch of chromosomes. On those chromosomes are the genes. Well, actually, on the chromosomes are the genes that make up the DNA. So each gene, you have a total of 46. Half of them came from your mom, half of them came from your dad. They lined up into pairs, and some of them are being expressed more in your, what we call phenotype, your appearance, your behaviors, your observable, outwardly appearance, and some of them are being masked by their partner. And so your gene, your genotype might be different from your phenotype. A really good example of that is those of us who have brown eyes. We may have one brown eye gene and one gene for another color, for a lighter color. And the presence of the brown is causing the blue not to be expressed in your phenotype. A lot of genes are dominant recessive, and if you have one there, then it'll express itself. That's dominant. Recessive, it takes both of them matching for that to express itself. So, for example, blue eyes requires two light color eye genes. They don't have to both be blue necessarily, but they both have to be light color genes for a person to express blue eyes. So the way that your parents' genes line up with each other and form pairs determines your genotype, what makeup you have, and then also this dominance recessive, codominance, other factors that you study in other classes determine your actual phenotype, how those genes are expressed. The thing that I want you guys to be aware of is genes are not computer programs, and you're not a robot. The genes that you carry can be turned on and off by the environment through feedback from the environment, and they can also be turned on and off by the other genes. So I was mentioning if you have a dominant gene and a recessive gene, the dominant gene turns off the effect of the recessive gene, so it just doesn't express itself. So genes can affect each other. What else you're carrying can affect the expression of the genes, but also your environment can turn certain genes on and off. And that's the thing that's really new and intriguing. It's a whole field called epigenetics, where we're trying to figure out how genes can actually be changed as a function of experience in the environment. It's a relatively new field, so there's a lot that isn't really well understood yet. So let's talk a little bit about how we know what we know about the impact of genes on our outcomes. So let's start with twins. Twins are a beautiful genetic experience for us scientists to explore. So if you're a twin, I don't know if you ever thought about yourself like that, but you're nature's experiment. Some twins are identical, and what we mean by that is that they share 100% of their genes in common because they started off as a single fertilized egg. So one sperm fertilized one egg, and that egg split at some point during fetal development or embryonic development. So it could be really early that it split, and you'd end up with two embryos growing into fetuses that are so separate, they separated so early on that they'd actually have separate placentas, which in this picture is that red area that they both have their umbilical cords attached to. And that's what communicates with mom is the placenta. And so the placenta collects nutrition and oxygen from mom and transfers waste for her to get rid of. If the splitting happens early enough in gestation, then the identical twins would have separate placentas. It used to be believed that to be an identical twin, you had to share a placenta, and now we know genetically that's not true. This picture that you see on the right, that's actually depicting what we kind of expect out of identical twins. Falsely, it turns out. They've got one placenta. They're both attached to that same placenta, but they're in their own amniotic sacs. So you can see that line drawn around them and the white around them. That's indicating that they have a membrane around them and they're floating in their own amniotic fluid. The more isolated the twins are within the uterus, the less similar their experience for the first 9 months of their lives, right, from conception until birth will be. So you can imagine that identical twins who have their own placentas and their own amniotic sacs will have less shared experience in the womb than identical twins who share a placenta. And they'll have less experience in common than identical twins who have the same placenta and are inside one amniotic sac because they split even later. So you can imagine that the environment has, a big impact from conception until birth. It's, what mom eats, what kinds of shocks she might have, so that she has an adrenaline rush, what kinds of noises or bright lights they might be exposed to through the abdominal wall, things like that can have an impact on the developing fetus. And so it's really important to think about the fact that the more similar your experience from conception to birth is, the more similar you probably will turn out to be because you've had similar inputs, right? So that's one thing to remember. We have identical twins who share 100% of their genes. Because they share 100% of their genes, they have to be the same sex because sex is genetically determined. And so if you ever see a twin pair where one is male and one is female, don't ever ask the mom, are they identical? Because by definition, they can't be. They don't share 100% of their genes because at least they differ on that 23rd pair. So identical twins, 100% of their genes shared. Now, having said that, the truth is it's not necessarily completely 100%. Sometimes when the egg splits, more information goes to one embryo that's going to go on to develop than the other. And sometimes we can have genetic abnormalities in one twin that are not present in the other one. And it's attributable to, an unfair or an uneven splitting of the genes. But generally, we say 100% of genes in common. With fraternal twins, you'll see that there are 2 sperm and 2 eggs there on the left-hand side of this panel. Because fraternal twins are created when the mom releases more than one egg and they both get fertilized. And the fertilization doesn't have to happen simultaneously like this picture implies. It can be as much as 2 weeks later that you could have conception. So you can have fraternal twins who not only are the other sex, right, because you don't have to be the same sex as your fraternal twin. You have the same probability of being the same sex with your fraternal twin as you would with any regular sibling, 50-50 probability that you'll match your fraternal twin sex or you'll be the opposite sex. So not only can they be different sex, they can be different ages, really, like as much as 2 weeks different in age. They usually are born at the same time now. And so a lot of times you wouldn't know, but if one of the twins is much smaller at birth, it might be because one twin is literally 2 weeks older. There have been all sorts of interesting case studies that have occurred thanks to the fact that you can get one egg fertilized one day and then days or weeks later get the other egg fertilized, so that you've had fraternal twins that aren't the same race, and all sorts of really interesting things that have happened because different fathers actually conceived the baby. So kind of an interesting little thing to think about that you might not have ever thought of before. Now, in this picture, you'll notice that the fraternal twins have different placentas and different amniotic sacs. They will always have separate placentas, and they will always have separate amniotic sacs. Now, it's kind of crowded in there, and so it's not unheard of to have fraternal twins have their placentas sort of entwined with each other to the point where it looks like it could be one big placenta, but it really is 2 separate ones. If you are a fraternal twin, you each grow your own placenta. And so you can imagine that by definition, fraternal twins are going to have more different experiences in the womb than some of the identical twins who share the same placenta or who share the same placenta and amniotic sacs. On average, fraternal twins share about 50% of their genes, just like regular siblings do. So if you have a full-blood regular sibling and you don't look that much like them, or you don't act that much like them, things like that, you might wonder to yourself, gosh, we're siblings. We had the same environment. How come we turned out so different? Well, you only share 50% of your genes with them. That's the same amount of genes as you share with either of your parents, right? You got half of your genes from your mom and half of your genes from your dad. So you are as closely related to your regular sibling or your fraternal twin as you are to your mom or to your dad. So yeah, you wouldn't expect exact same combination of genes or expression of genes. So it's important to know these two different kinds of twins. I'm belaboring this point because you need to know the two different kinds of twins because we use them in what are called twin studies. One of the best ways to study twins happened, I want to say by accident, because initially a lot of this was done in the 1930s and this was accidental. Some of it was done deliberately, and you guys might have seen a movie on Netflix about the bad version where the researcher on purpose separated twins and triplets at birth. But early in the 1930s and 40s, twins were being separated not for any kind of bad reason, but because a lot of times when parents were registered to adopt a child, they only wanted one. I don't know if they didn't ever think about the possibility of twins, and maybe they would have taken two, or if the adoption agency just thought, let's just split them up so that we can get more families to have babies. I don't know what they were thinking, but back in the 30s and 40s, it wasn't done maliciously. It was done to expedite adoptions. So they would separate twins. Now today, we all know that doesn't sound like a very good idea. But back then, they didn't really think about it. And so babies would be born and they would be adopted out to separate families. In the 1980s, there was a big recognition of this, that, 40 and 50 years ago, people had been adopted out of twin or triplet sets. And let's get them back together. Let's reunite these twins and triplets. And so the Minnesota Twin Study was started in the Twin Cities in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And they started tracking down these twins and bringing them together and reuniting them. And given, of course, the catch is that the psychologists wanted to study them, right, and see what kinds of things they shared in common and what kinds of things they were different on. And were identicals just as similar to each other after having been reared apart as fraternals were? Like, maybe it doesn't matter that you share 100% of your genes in common, or you only share 50% of your genes in common. Maybe environment's all that matters, right? They did find differences, though. What they found is that identical twins who were reunited were more similar in personality traits. And one of the things we're going to talk about later in class is that personality is pretty flexible when we're little. It's hard to pin down and really measure it correctly. But by your 40s and 50s, you're really starting to show a lot of stability in your personality characteristics. So the fact that the identicals were more alike than the fraternals were really suggests that their genes were being expressed. Regardless of whatever experiences that they had in the environment, their personality was being expressed. Now, when we talk about personality, we may not be talking about what you're thinking we're talking about in psychology. The two things that really were important traits were extroversion, and by that they really meant how sociable the twins were, how much they like to be around other people, how much they like to talk, how friendly they are. The other thing that they really focused in on was neuroticism, how stable their emotions are. Are they moody? Are they very consistent? And so the twins who were moody and were identical twins their sibling tended to also be moody. The ones who were very sociable, their identical twin also tended to be very sociable. And flip those around, right? Same thing. The fraternals were more different from each other. So they shared qualities, but they were more different than the identicals. Weirdly, other behavioral outcomes that might be attributable to these personality characteristics, like rate of divorce, was more likely to match among identicals than among fraternals. One thing we have seen in just the general population is that when one member of a married couple is high in neuroticism, the marriage has a much higher rate of failure. So when one member is moody, or two will virtually ensure that this is going to end in divorce, as far as the statistics go. So when we see that we have higher matching of divorce rate among identicals, it might be attributable to something like personality. Otherwise, it sounds kind of, how'd you pick divorce? But it makes a lot of sense when you start realizing what might drive divorce. And then abilities like an overall intelligence, general intelligence, seems to be largely genetic, because identical twins are a lot more similar, even ones who are reared apart. So if I knew that this pair of people in front of me were identical twins who had been raised separately but shared 100% of their genes in common, if I knew the score that one had earned, I'd have about a 75% probability of being right if I just guessed the other one has the same score. That's how similar their scores were. So a lot of really big basic things matched more often in the identicals than they did in the fraternals. And it really underscores the idea that genes play a role in these factors. Okay, another way that we can look at the exact same question is to flip it around. So instead of biologically related people being reared apart and then comparing them later, what these researchers did was looked at adoptive families and looked to see whether people who are adopted are more similar to their adoptive family or more similar to their biological family. What they have found on a lot of factors, all of the ones that I listed on the last slide, is that they are less like their adoptive parents and more like their biological parents. That if we were to compare the adoptees' intelligence score to their adopted parents and their biological parents, even though they've never met their biological parents, they are more similar to their biological parents, especially if we don't test until they're 16 or older, when intelligence sorts itself out and really becomes stable. Personality characteristics, again, if we wait until they're in their mid-20s to test, we see that the adoptees are more like their biological family than they are like their adoptive family. So it really underscores that genes ultimately, as we mature, seem to play a larger role than environment does in determining these kinds of outcomes. Now, having said that, please do not think that the behavior geneticists think that parenting doesn't matter. It does, obviously. I've read articles where people who don't like the behavior geneticist's goal, which is trying to figure out what part of these outcomes is due to genes and what part is due to environment, they've argued, you're making it sound like we could just throw our children into a closet until they're 16 or whatever, and they'll just come out fully formed and ready to go. Well, obviously not. That is not what the researchers are trying to suggest. What research has shown is that parenting has big influences on a lot of really sort of nuanced aspects of our behavior and our attitudes and our personalities, right? Very strong influences on religious beliefs, our general value system, our manners, the attitudes that we hold about things, our political orientation, different kinds of habits that we engage in. These things oftentimes can be traced back to our family of origin in the form of parenting, the things our parents have emphasized for us. So it would be a bad idea to not actually raise our children for the first few years of their lives. They need that. They need the foundation of style, like cultural factors get conveyed through parenting and things like that. But what behavior geneticists are trying to figure out, just to make it super clear, is just what part of our outcomes are due to genes and what part of our outcomes are due to environment. One of the things that's really tricky is that for most people, not these twins that I mentioned in the Minnesota twin study, not these adoptees that I was talking about, but for most of us, the same people who gave us our genes are the same people who give us our environment. And a lot of times they give us an environment that's consistent with their own genes, right? Like this is their predisposition. So they're behaving in ways that are driven by their genetic predispositions, and those strategies may encourage the expression of our natural genes, right? And so we may be behaving in ways that, are consistent with how our parents parented us, but are also consistent with the genes that we inherited from our parents. And so it's really hard to pull those two things apart. That's why the twin study is so important, and that's why the adoption studies are so important, because otherwise you really can't separate out parenting from genes if the same people gave us our genes as our parenting. So let's talk a little bit about my earlier claim that genes can be turned on and off by the environment. How does this work? Well, when we talk about a gene-environment interaction, we're talking about things like, you guys know this, that some animals, their fur changes color for the winter, right? Like Arctic foxes and things. Their fur will actually turn white for the winter, or certain hairs. Their genes interact with environmental cues like length of the day, and that triggers their genes to change and start expressing something different. So as they're growing in new fur, it's coming in white. And then at the end of the season, when the days start getting longer again, those genes flip and they start reacting differently. And now they start putting out fur that's their normal dark color. I don't know which one is normal. If they spend 6 months one color and 6 months the other, I don't know which one's the normal one. Same thing for, you know, the tendency to hibernate or to sleep really protracted lengths of time during the wintertime. That's the genes that the animal carries interacts with the environment. Epigenetics, which I mentioned earlier, looks at how the input from the environment can actually not just change the expression of our genes, but possibly actually change our genes. So they've looked at, for example, in animals, that if the animal is obese, because the researchers overfed the animal and the animal was willing to do it, if the animal was overweight and obese because they actually maintained it for a long period of time in their life, it actually turns off their weight regulation genes so that they can actually hold on to that weight. And then they find that in the offspring, that gene is in the off position so that their weight regulation is off. And so the offspring have a predisposition towards obesity. Okay, that's a new claim. Actually, it sounds a lot like an old claim. Lamarck used to say this, that if the parent breaks their arm, that the child will be born with a mended bone where the parent had broken their arm. Well, that is not true. It sounds like kind of what he said, though, right? The idea that if the parent carries extra weight prior to reproduction, that it can alter the parent's genes and have an impact on their offspring's ability to regulate their own weight. So that's an interesting question that epigenetics has been looking at, the idea that there's such an interaction between environment and genes that we can actually see the impact of the environment on offspring. And these are going to be especially important when we're talking about things that happen to us before we are of reproductive age, so that then we could possibly even have altered genes that we pass off to our offspring. Once reproduction has occurred, it doesn't matter whether it alters your genes, you're not passing them on anymore. So interesting things to think about. And so I wanted to emphasize something that I had mentioned with regard to twins, and I want to emphasize it for all of us. We have our genes, and then we have the environment. And the environment starts in the womb. Things that mom is exposed to, like maybe she had to go on to antibiotics for an infection that she had, and the only kind of antibiotic that works on that particular infection is one that actually harms baby's teeth. We would see that in the phenotype of the offspring, that even though the baby had genes for healthy teeth, the environment changed that expression, right? Different kinds of toxins, we call those teratogens in pregnancy, when you're exposed to something that can actually alter the healthy development of the offspring. Mom's nutrition, any stress that she's under, these things are all providing environmental influences on the developing fetus. Now in this chart, it's labeled postnatal. That's referring to like the infancy period, the really super critical infancy period, when things, in the environment can really have a big impact on the development of the offspring. By juvenile, we're talking about, older childhood and into adolescence, where we're having stylistic issues influencing us, right? So at all these different stages, based on feedback from the environment, we can end up expressing our genes differently and possibly even alter our genes that then we could pass on to our offspring. So kind of a new area, like I said, maybe 20 years. Now, something which is still a biological explanation of psychological behavior would be evolutionary psychology. Different from behavior genetics. It's almost the flip opposite side. Evolutionary psychology is looking at how evolutionary principles help to explain the origin and function of the human mind, traits, and behaviors. If you think about behavior genetics for a second, it's really trying to understand individual differences. In evolutionary psychology, we're trying to look for species-wide consistencies, things that seem to be outcomes that have benefited our species over time. So kind of think about it like that. Behavior genetics is looking at individual differences. Evolutionary psychology is trying to make big themes for the species of humans. Evolutionary psychology depends on natural selection, and I think a lot of teachers kind of avoid talking about how natural selection works. I'll just give you a quickie little simple example. Apparently not super quick, because apparently I've got the world's slowest animation going on here. But we start off and we've got the species genome, like the DNA pattern for, let's say, humans, right? So we've got the species genome, and we've got a niche, as Darwin called it. You might call it your environment or your ecosystem, that has conditions that favor certain traits. So let's stay in humans. In the U.S., our conditions favor outgoingness in general. There's some nuances of different states, but on average in the U.S., the squeaky wheel gets the grease, as opposed to, let's say, Japan, where the nail that sticks up will be pounded down, right? In our culture, we have aphorisms that refer to, get out and be assertive, be outgoing. In Japan, they have aphorisms that refer to, don't stick out, don't call attention to yourself, don't be outgoing. So let's say that you're raising a child in the U.S., and the conditions of the U.S. favor outgoingness. Wait for it. Now, this is a little overly dramatic when I give you a personality trait as an example, but the idea is that these traits being favored by the environment, if you possess those traits, you will be more successful. Make it to adulthood, be able to reproduce. That's the basic idea with evolutionary psychology, is that the environment favors certain traits. Those traits, people who possess those traits are more likely to make it to adulthood and successfully reproduce. And that causes their genes to be selected for being carried on to the next generation and makes those genes more common. Now, is everybody in the U.S. outgoing? No, that's not what I'm trying to suggest. I'm just trying to suggest that we could use something like outgoingness as an example of the kind of thing that in evolutionary psychology might be preserved. Let's look at some other examples of things that might be preserved. Stranger anxiety. All around the world, somewhere between about 9 months and 13 months, infants start to show fear of strangers. They want their parents to hold them. They want to be with their parents, things like that. Let's imagine if you're an infant who doesn't show this. You're starting to get mobile. I couldn't find a 9 to 13-month-old walking by themselves on the internet. So I found what appears to be probably more like a 3-year-old. Just pretend like that's a 9 to 13-month-old toddling by themselves down what appears to be a pier to me. A baby who's not scared of strangers and goes off by themselves, they could wander off and get lost. They could fall off the pier because nobody's really caring for them and making sure that they don't fall off because they wandered off by themselves. There's no parent there to, prevent them from doing dangerous things. As a result, they're more likely to, not to be graphic, but not make it to adulthood, right? And less likely to get their genes into the future. So we may be seeing this all around the world because the genes that would have favored being inappropriately daring with regard to strangers have sort of been washed out. There's probably, still some people who have like inherited two genes from their parents that are both for risk taking in the 9 to 13 month period, and there's a higher rate of injury or death when you have these kinds of expressions. So it may benefit our species. The babies are scared at this stage. Babies who display just regular stranger anxiety, what we mean by that, by the way, is that they want to stick close to their parents. They don't want to reach out to see the stranger trying to hold the baby, and the baby sort of shrinking back. That's stranger anxiety. They're like, who are you and why do you want to hold me? Babies who want to hang around with their parents have the benefit of their parents being there, and they're less likely to get hit by a car in modern times or fall off a cliff in ancient times or those kinds of things. What about the complete opposite end? What if we emphasized stranger anxiety? What if somehow our genes had selected for stranger anxiety to start at 9 months and just keep intensifying? Well, you could then end up with people who have social anxiety, which makes them unwilling to ever be away from their loved ones. It could even be to the degree that it's a psychological disorder where they really seriously, they have a phobic level of being away from the familiar. Again, if you're afraid to be around other people, you're probably not going to find an appropriate mate, right? If you're only around people who you're already related to, it's going to possibly take you out of the gene pool. So we may have sort of selectively, naturally selected out the tendency towards social anxiety to that sort of psychological disorder, so that we only now have a small percentage of people who have that. Got rid of those who weren't fearful enough. Now we only have a small percentage of people who are like that, and the vast majority of people have that period between 9 months and 13 months where they display this tendency. All right. Brace yourself. Evolutionary psychologists ask really hard questions to figure out what kinds of decisions people make. So obviously, I'm not going to know what you say anyway, so don't worry about it. I'm just going to explain what the average respondent said and how the evolutionary psychologists have interpreted it. But brace yourself. These are not easy decisions I'm going to use as examples, but I pulled this from their research. I'm going to also mention something else before I get too deep into evolutionary psychology. Did you notice on the slide that talked about natural selection that the whole theory turns on reproduction? That's it. It's all about what genes get carried into the future. So I've had students object in class that this theory is homophobic, or that it's transphobic, or biased, or whatever. It is biased. It has it's attempting to explain behavior through a particular lens. And so it's not going to explain everybody's behavior. I mean, if we just go back to this slide, some people do have social anxiety in our culture. It's usually about 1 to 2% of people, but some people do. Some people do not have normal fears of strangers when they're toddlers. That's about 1 to 2% of the population. So it doesn't explain everybody at all. That's 4% of the population that's probably not being explained by this explanation of how beneficial stranger anxiety is. So we're not explaining everybody. We're in evolutionary psychology, what we're trying to explain is the reproductively oriented behaviors that get certain traits to be carried to the next generation, right? So, and how over time these traits have accumulated and are repeatedly showing up. So it's easy to look through a particular lens and say, this isn't explaining me or people I know, or it seems like it's like mean or meanly biased. But it's just a theory. We're going to see a lot of theories in this class where you're like, I don't like this theory. And, you're welcome to think that. So, tough question coming. So we've got fraternal twins. One's a boy and one's a girl. So clearly they're the same age. They're out on this boat, which I found a nice artist's rendering of a boat on a lake. And they're out on the boat with their parent, who's you. So you are out on this boat with your fraternal twins. One is a boy and one is a girl. The boat suddenly flips over in such a violent way that one of your twins goes flying one direction and one of your twins goes flying the other direction. You can only save one of those twins. There is nothing you can do to make that not be true. One of those twins is going to drown. I told you this is terrible. This is what they say. Sorry. So you're going to drown if you sit there and think too long. They're both going to drown if you sit and think too long. You have to take one. You have to go for one. Which do you go for? Well, the average respondent in these research studies have said, whoops, I thought I had the answer there. Sorry. Have said boy. And when I ask my students, which did you pick? Most commonly it's boy. And the reasoning is often, well, the boy carries on the family name. Well, that's a little bit of a euphemism for what evolutionary psychologists think is really going on. Males have a greater ability to reproduce than females do. You can imagine that a male could, if you had an unlimited number of willing and ovulating females just lined up, I don't even know what the limit would be on how many the male could presumably impregnate. I don't know. It doesn't work in reverse. Once a woman's pregnant, that's it. That's all. She's already pregnant. So there are pressures for females to be more selective about with whom they reproduce. There's also a limitation on how many potential grandchildren you in the boat, and you not being actually you, just you, the person in the boat, there's a limit on how many grandchildren that girl twin could provide to you as opposed to how many grandchildren that boy twin could provide. In reality, if there was an unplanned pregnancy, there's a high probability you would ever not even know that your fraternal twin boy fathered children. But the key thing is in evolutionary psychology, the idea is that even if you don't get to know your offspring, your genes are carried on, and that's the motive. So that's the interpretation on why you would pick the boy. Now you're back in that dang boat, even though you almost let your twins drown. Now you've got your two sons. One of them's 5 years old and one is 1 year old. So now they're the same sex, so that's not going to be your driving factor. You've got a 5-year-old and a 1-year-old. And if you didn't put life jackets on them, I can't believe it. But now you're back out there and it flips again exactly like it did the last time, and your sons go flying in two different directions, and you've got to decide, I only get one. Neither can swim, in case you're thinking to yourself, well, maybe this 5-year-old's learned to swim because you're such a neglectful parent. But nope, neither can swim. Neither can save themselves. You've got to save one, and the other one's going to drown. Which one do you go for? Well, this one, the argument is that you would go for the 5-year-old, and not because you know them better, or maybe the 1-year-old wouldn't know what was happening, or other things that make it sound nicer. According to the evolutionary psychologists, we picked the 5-year-old because the 5-year-old's already made it through the risky infancy period, where the mortality rate is higher. So the 5-year-old is a better bet for you reproductively to get your genes into the next generation after the 5-year-old. He has a better chance of making it to adulthood. So you go for the 5-year-old because of that. Okay, let's take a different perspective. Let's get out of that boat. We've got a new baby. All right, I found a picture where the baby's on its tummy, so you have no cues, no clue the sex of this baby. So you're just going on the fact that it's a baby, and the grandparents are all there to see the baby at the hospital. Who is more ecstatic? The mom's parents or the dad's parents? Well, evolutionary psychology says that the mom's parents will be more ecstatic. And here's why. Couple of layers. So bear with me. Okay, remember earlier I told you that a son represents more opportunity to reproduce? So for the dad's parents, there's sort of less enthusiasm because this is in their mind sort of like one of an unknown number, maybe, of offspring. So that's one implication, that their son could reproduce even without this particular woman. Like, this sounds very cold-hearted, but this is thought to be going on in the sort of limbic system part of the brain, where the parents aren't doing it on purpose. They're just, these are the facts. The other side of it, on the mom's side, the reason why the mom's parents are so excited is because each offspring that daughter produces is one of what they know for sure is going to be a few. You know, there are a few families in the U.S. who have 19 children, but those families aside, most women do not have 19 children, right? They have some finite number that's much lower than that. So for the mom's parents, they know that this is one of the few grandchildren that this daughter is going to make for them. Maybe even more importantly is the other layer, which is the mom's parents know for sure that this offspring represents their genes because it just came out of their daughter. So they know for sure that that is their genes. Whereas the dad's parents, I'm sure they know that their son's baby mama, whether it's married or living together or whatever it is, I'm sure that they know that that's really theirs, but not to the degree that the mom's parents do. And so according to evolutionary psychology, in the back of each of their minds, that unconscious limbic system, the parents of the mom are thinking, unfettered, I know this is my grandchild. I know that this child, especially think about it, the mom of the mom absolutely knows that. She, without question, knows that that is the child of my loins and that is the child of my child's loins. I know that. Whereas the men involved in it there's always a little plausible deniability. There was a study in a hospital in Oregon I guess it was about 15 years ago now, where they did a DNA test of all the babies that were born there and their purported parents, right? And I say purported because 10% of the dads were not DNA related to what they thought was their DNA-related offspring. So there is the possibility that you're not actually the father of the child that you think is your child, whereas it's impossible to think you're the mother of a child and not really be the mother of the child, right? So it's a different degree of confidence. Those are tough questions. Those are one lens for interpreting big behaviors that we might see in humans. Evolutionary psychologists attempt to explain a very finite number of human behaviors. One is reproductive behaviors, how we pick our mates, how we determine whether we're willing to give up custody of our offspring or not, things like that. So reproductive things, evolutionary psychologists are really good at that. They explain some other big basic human behaviors like body language, laughter, things like that all humans do. And that's not even really dependent on reproduction. They're just looking at, what behaviors do we see consistently across all cultures, and therefore it's probably been selected for through reproduction. But there is a limited number of things that evolutionary psychology attempts to explain. So that's something else to keep in mind, that it doesn't explain all of us as individuals, because it's not concerned with individual differences. It's concerned about species-wide behaviors. So it has that focus of species-wide explanation. It does not explain any of us individually, and it only attempts to explain a small subset of human behaviors. All right, enough on that. Let's take a break here, and we will come back in the next segment, and we will talk about consciousness.